That was brilliant. And you mentioned how you, with Hegel, you sort of get this idea that you can trust consciousness
Mm,
in a way it can really tell us something about what is real. And
mm,
I remember in one of your videos, I'm not sure if it was you or your wife, but you guys, I think it was both of you guys, you were talking about how before the photograph, there was just this sort of natural immediacy. And
mm.
in the past, there was a certain immediacy. And for Hegel, this sort of immediacy is unfreedom in the sense that only with consciousness and subjectivity do we transcend immediacy and we're able to look upon ourselves as conscious beings. So I was wondering, and I know when you were talking about the um, sort of immediacy before the photograph, it was in the context of the meaning crisis. So I'm wondering, like, I know you guys talk about this a lot. How does Hegel, what can he say about the meaning crisis, and
Mm.
how can really taking into account Hegel's project of analyzing consciousness as it becomes for itself, how could that offer some solutions or maybe even questions even concerning the meaning crisis that we're now undeniably facing?
That is such an excellent question. You need to you need to start a business where people hire you to like frame really good questions. That is so
Yeah,
excellent, Trey. That was marvelous. In the piece, and one, if it was a good idea, it probably came from Michelle. So if I take credit for it, it's
I
my,
think it
it's
was her, if I'm being
thievery.
honest.
Yeah, of course it was. There's a piece called Representing Beauty, which is on the idea that before the camera is invented, you can't, there's not even the horizon, the possibility space where you look at a tree and think that could be a picture. But now, once the technology is invented, it is no longer possible to look at a tree and not, even if you don't have a camera, to think of it as a potential tree. A potential picture, right? Because it could be a picture. The technology has transformed the horizon, and the term we use is towardness. Our towardness toward things changes.
Mhm.
Once we can treat, once we have inscript, I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, but it is to say that what things can be in their potentiality transforms relative to
Mhm.
new, in that example, we'll be talking about technologies. And this, of course, would say this then got into a discussion on the necessity of being aware of that, so you don't fall into like Heideggerian thinking or Deleuzian
Right.
capture or things or so on. Because what ends up happening is that you start thinking about everything in terms of being potential photographs and not even realize that that way of thinking about things has been oriented by your technological state, by the state of technology today, and it does your thinking for you, per se. So to be aware of that. Well, if we take this consciousness, so the question I like to ask, like for me, it's almost like an entirely new line of inquiry that Hegel opens up that I like to frame as the following. Like if we take the idea seriously that consciousness is for itself, like that it's trying to gain greater self-understanding, self-consciousness is the term I use. And again, I'm using it a little more broadly than Hegel is using it. Then we can ask the question, like in the ways like, how is my experience of this laptop for consciousness gaining self-consciousness? I could say, well, I learned that consciousness is something that understands the world in terms of colors and shapes and so on and so forth. Well, likewise, I can look at the comments like, so how is technology for consciousness? What is consciousness trying to learn about itself in understanding this tree now as a potential picture? Well, it's to say, one of the things you learn is that consciousness is dramatically conditioned by its technological situation, by the technology of the day, just automatically, thoughtlessly. That doesn't mean stupidly. By thoughtlessly, I mean it is something you do without even being aware that you do it. It's a kind of a given thing. So consciousness is very naturally structured by givens, and the givens tend to be very conditioned by the socioeconomic order and by the technologies that are around. Okay, well, why would consciousness want to be structured like that? Well, you start thinking, you say, well, maybe it's because consciousness wants to save energy, because it's just kind of easy to accept whatever the givens are of the socioeconomic order, right? And you say, okay, well, what kind of thing is consciousness then in order to be seeking to reduce energy? You say, well, maybe it's very linked up to the brain because the brain is a biological system and it wants to reduce energy. Maybe it's because consciousness wants to focus on more important things. Maybe consciousness is aware that since it is always going to be ultimately situated within a physical world that is going to be conditioned by its technology, that maybe it's better to kind of go along with that in different things like that. So there's a bunch of possibilities that open up when you start taking seriously the idea. You can ask different kinds of questions about what is happening in the world and how you're understanding the world and how you're conditioned by the world, once you start asking the question, how is this for consciousness gaining self-consciousness? And that's also very important. And I guess then I'll pass it back to you, because the very act of even being aware that that the experience of the tree is framed. Oh, that's funny. Framed by the existence of the camera. If you are even asking that, then you are aware that is occurring, and therefore you're not thoughtless anymore, right? It's no longer something you absorb. It's something that you know is happening, and then you can choose it, or you can choose to go beyond it, or you can choose to accept it. So there is a gaining of freedom here, right? That's one of the key components in Hegel. There's a gaining of freedom. But of course, since Hegel's ironic and literary in that sense, freedom is always a double-edged sword. As you get more freedom, you also get more existential tension, because you know it could be different or that you're conditioned, but there's also more possibility. And so much of Hegel that's so interesting is, to put it very generally, there could be an increase of freedom while simultaneously suggesting a need to change the kind of person we are in order to handle that increase of freedom. There's a double action that's going on versus merely an increase of freedom, but no changing of the person who is gaining that freedom. So there's a double action that's really important. That is a kind of also description of the dialectic as well, like the kind of tension that never goes away, but it is also it's also a progressive tension, even if the tension itself does not never goes away, because in our minds there's no progress if the tension stays, but in Hegel there can be a tension that can drive you forward. Now, what the nature of that progress is, and that's always debated, and how that translates into a socioeconomic order and so on and so forth. But there is a tension there that once you're aware of, say, what the example of the tree, you becoming aware of that can then move you to ask greater questions and to seek greater self-understanding and so on and so forth.